For centuries, the struggle for freedom and self-determination has defined the African American experience in the United States. But what if we frame this struggle not merely as a fight for civil rights, but as a fight against a historical injustice, one that designates African Americans as political prisoners in an ongoing ethnic war that began in 1452? The Ethnic War of 1452, initiated by the Papal Bull Dum Diversas, issued by Pope Nicholas V, authorized the enslavement of non-Christians, paving the way for the transatlantic slave trade. This decree marked the beginning of a systematic dehumanization of African and indigenous peoples, laying the groundwork for centuries of exploitation.
Perhaps many of you here are not acquainted with the subject of slavery. I will therefore explain to you what it is. First, let us imagine a child to have been born of slave parents. Poor, unfortunate child. From that very day, his birthday, he is considered and classed as a brute. From that very day, he becomes property, the property of a master, who may sell him and do with him what he pleases.
Indigenous copper-colored peoples of the Americas were not only subjected to brutal colonization, but were also forcibly taken from their lands and transported to Europe and Africa. Many were enslaved and exploited, severing their ties to their ancestral lands. This displacement created a complex web of family connections, as some descendants of these indigenous peoples living abroad are relatives to those who remained in the Americas, many of whom were also enslaved or forced onto reservations.
The reality of our historical past, particularly with regard to slavery, is a hideous legacy of one of history's most tragic events, the birth of the Africa to America transatlantic slave trade. Many of us know that the colonialization and development of the Americas, North, Central, and South America, depended heavily upon the transatlantic trade in human trafficking. We also know that in every European empire in the Americas, it was enslaved Africans and indigenous Indians that produced all significant exports for centuries. Also, we know that the foundations of the Atlantic slave trade have been studied by scholars the world over for decades, including the origins and demographic composition of both the indigenous Indian and African populations. Not only did the Spanish Empire play an important role in the Americas, but the Spanish colonies have a much broader history than their British, French, Dutch, or Portuguese counterparts. The Spanish involvement in the trade was so great, it impacted all other European countries involved in the trade. It took captives from almost all African slave regions, orchestrated and transported enslaved Africans to almost all of the American colonies. Not only was it a major source of African slaves in the overseas transatlantic trade, but it also dominated in the intra-American traffic that later became a primary source of slaves. During this period, Spain was an enormous global power, whose link between economics and slavery made it the most important political entity in the Americas. With political decrees within the Spanish court, assisted by religious edicts by the Catholic Church, the slave trade expanded and prospered. The kingdoms of Portugal and Spain had been posturing for possession of the African coast and colonial territories for more than a century. Believing that the Catholic Church could resolve these disputes. Each sought and obtained papal bulls to support its claims. In the mid-15th century, the Pope gave the Portuguese the right to explore Africa. Later, he gave them the right to enslave anyone who was not practicing the Christian religion. This was done with the Papal Bull Dum Diversas in 1452. This papal bull authorized the enslavement of Muslims, pagans, and other non-Christians, while the Romanus Pontifex and the Inter Cajeteja laid the foundations for mercantilism and the transatlantic slave trade.
The Papal Bull Dum Diversas not only legitimized slavery, but also framed it within a religious context, promoting the idea that enslaved individuals were lesser beings. This set a dangerous precedent for racial superiority that continues to influence societal structures today.
The Spanish Empire was one of the first European empires to actually unify politics and religion. Spanish Jews were forced to convert to Catholicism, and those that did not convert were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. Later, an edict was declared that Moors must convert to Catholicism or be exiled. Under the rule of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, the slave trade in Spain was closely regulated and controlled. Laws existed concerning the sources of slaves, their conditions, and possible liberation. However, it was Queen Isabella who also approved the edict entitled La Encomienda, a system that started the practice of forced unpaid slavery upon indigenous peoples. Originally, the encomienda system was a method of rewarding soldiers and financial backers who fought against and helped conquer the Moors before they were exiled. This right was formally protected by the Spanish crown and permitted encomienderos to extract free labor and tribute from conquered people who were considered vassals of the crown. In turn, these soldiers and financial backers were required to ensure that natives were given instruction in the Catholic faith, the Spanish language, and protected from other warring tribes and pirates. The Spanish crown awarded these licenses as a grant to particular individuals. It was held as a monopoly on the labor of particular groups of indigenous people and was in perpetuity to the holder and his or her descendants. In many cases, natives were forced to do hard labor and subjected to extreme punishment and death if they resisted. Later, the Spanish crown reformed the encomienda laws, restricting the holding of the grant to only 2 generations instead of perpetuity. When the crown tried to implement the policy, Spanish landholders rebelled against the crown.
Today, we must recognize that African Americans are not merely descendants of slaves, but rather political prisoners, victims of an ongoing ethnic war that has robbed them of their right to self-determination. According to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, every individual has the right to participate in the cultural life of the community and to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. This has been systematically denied to African Americans and indigenous peoples alike.
A political prisoner is one who, for the most part, is incarcerated because of his or her political beliefs and some type of action that is in opposition to the United States government. We define a prisoner of war as an individual who is a member of a nation or a citizen of a nation who was struggling for national liberation against U.S. imperialism, for example, Native Americans or Puerto Ricans or New African Independence Movement, and who engages the enemy in some armed military action. And for the most part, they are part of the military clandestine formation. And therefore, when they get captured, in most cases, they take the position that they're prisoners of war who are captured in a battle for national liberation.
This is American justice. That's right. This is American democracy. Right. And those of you who are familiar with it know that in America, democracy is hypocrisy. Right. Now, if I'm wrong, put me in jail. Right. But if you can't prove that a democracy is not hypocrisy, then don't put your hands on me. Right. Democracy is hypocrisy. Right. If democracy means freedom, why aren't our people free? Right. If democracy means justice, why don't we have justice? Right. If democracy means equality, why don't we have equality?
Black people should understand that the New African Independence Movement is not new. The New Africa, the term New Africa is new, but the struggle for self-determination and the struggle for independence on these shores is a struggle as old as the slavery that of black people who've been brought here.
The debate around reparations often focuses on the descendants of enslaved individuals, but framing this argument through the lens of political prisoners elevates the conversation. It shifts the focus from individual compensation to collective justice and the restoration of rights. The United States has already taken a step toward acknowledging this injustice by formally apologizing for slavery, admitting guilt in the eyes of the global community. It's crucial to recognize the interconnectedness of these histories. The descendants of indigenous copper-colored peoples who were taken from the Americas share a legacy with those who remained, many of whom continue to live on reservations and face systemic inequalities. This shared history underscores the need for a reparative approach that honors the rights of all affected communities. As we advocate for reparations, we must emphasize the historical context of African Americans and indigenous peoples as prisoners of war. This perspective not only supports the case for reparations, but also calls for a broader recognition of human rights violations that demand accountability and restoration. The fight for justice is ongoing. By framing this struggle within the context of the ethnic war of 1452, we not only honor the legacy of those who suffered, but also empower future generations to reclaim their rights and dignity. It's time to recognize the truth and work towards a future where justice is served.
The revolutionary philosopher Franz Fanon says that what happens is that the victim begins to agitate. He uses all types of means against his executioner in fighting for a position of equality. After he tries a number of means and they do not work, he then begins to imitate the means by which his executioner kept him down. That is usually through force and violence. He says, and then they begin to use it against them, breaking the one taboo that they've never been able to break, hitting back against their executioners. So that you ought not to be upset. If we are violent, the United States taught us very well how to be violent.
And we're going to say it after this, and after I'm locked up, and after everybody's locked up, that you can jail revolutionaries, but you can't jail a revolution.